Oh, righty then. Hello, everyone. 26th July, 5-ish. This and that. Welcome to This and That. Continuing a talk about rentierism. Yesterday I was talking about that we're in a phase of capitalism that emphasizes rentierism, and the idea that rent is sort of reconfigured or rethought about. And so I'm adding yet another article to our little pile of articles to read. First off, I will carry over from what we were doing yesterday, some commentary on the key texts. In our little pod group, I'd like at some moment to start talking about the 674-page Capitalism in the 21st Century. And so contemporary Western capitalism, Piketty argues, is merely patrimonial in contrast to the more egregious hyper-patrimonialism of the 19th century. We have, in short, a less extreme form of rentier society that has moved from a society with a small number of very wealthy rentiers to one with a much larger number of less wealthy rentiers. Excuse me. Another important book about class inequality and this augmented role of individual or household assets, following swiftly on Piketty's heels, is Guy Standing's 2016, The Corruption of Capitalism. Guy Standing posits a new class segmentation consisting of 7 class fractions, distinguished not only by occupational status, but also with the assets they do not own. He groups these 7 factions into 2 sets of 4 and 3 fractions, respectively. The first set comprises the plutocracy, the elite, the salariat, those people who are in relatively secure salary jobs, and proficients, freelance professionals. And the second fraction comprises the proletariat, the precariat, people who have live with unstable labor and living, and lumpen precariat, an underclass of social victims relying on charity, often homeless and destitute. And so these class fractions are, just another way if we can talk about how we could label class even in the 21st century and identify them in fairly useful ways. And particularly being rentiers allows us to sort of see how some of that operates, particularly in the case of urban cultures. In contemporary Western capitalism, there's 7 main categories of assets that generate income, that is rent for the renters who control them. And so there are these underlying categories of asset categories. First one that we were talking about the last couple of days is property assets, which we can sort of generalize to land and its various appurtenances, including both residential and commercial buildings. The second category is financial assets. Third is intellectual property assets. Fourth is natural resources. Fifth is platform assets, that is digital platforms. The sixth is long-term service contracts of all kinds. And the seventh, the last, comprises infrastructures for the delivery of telecommunication, energy, transportation, and similar services. So there's a lot of stuff there. And, without going through that in a pretty heavy duty way, it's just to remind you that there are these kind of subforms that are still viable, whether you're thinking of it in a Marxist way or not. And some of the same issues still apply. That is, questions of productive versus non-productive labor, the difference between use values and surplus values. All of those things and their roles still exist, and they exist in an interesting kind of correlated way. Today's little article, which seems a little redundant, but it emphasizes a slight difference of in terms of commentaries on Brett Christopher's Rentier Capitalism. And I know that may seem horribly boring, but I would assert to you that rather than having a rent-seeking society, although we have a rent-seeking society, that rentier capitalism has a lot more things going on in it, And the may seem a little redundant from an earlier thing I did on the commons. And I'm coming back to, I always come back to the commons because there are common resources defined in a variety of ways. Some have been relatively traditional in terms of public space. That is a public sphere kind of space. And in other ways, it is the general notion of democratic space, an interesting problem to be related to issues of rent or rentier capitalism, where often some of our rights to these sorts of spaces are contested or contestable. And information rights are part of that renting problem. So there's a Karakillik writes a brief response to sort of to work through what Brett Christopher's books, a couple of texts work on in terms of rentier capitalism. Some people don't like pursuing it that way simply because the rent notion gets you far afield, and some people don't like relating it to issues related to labor, which is on the one hand contestable. On the other hand, if you sort of accept the idea of a kind of knowledge-based capitalism and information, a capitalism that includes information products or knowledge products, you sort of have to go there, especially since there's a significant number of them, and that a significant amount of the economy, global economy, relies on. In recent years, we've seen an increasing number of publications that offer the term of rentierism to define the current economic system in the global north. More recently, Brett Christopher's has produced a series of work that aims to account for the ascendancy of rentierism from a political economy perspective in which Marx is mostly neglected. This exchange article aims to bring Marx and Marxist thought back into discussion to read rentierism politically. And in particular, it inquires into how rentierism relates to the nature of class relations by addressing an open secret, namely that rentierism rests essentially on the enclosure and expropriation of the commons. And part of this, of course, is the kinds of things that Yanis Varoufakis comments on in terms of a techno-feudalism. And you could say that certain elements of this are what drive certain types of venture capital as well, but that's not what we're going to think about today. That is, this sort of work analyzes rentierism as capital's counter movement, enforcing its priorities and drives on spaces where alternative social systems emerge and develop. In the final part, the provocative conclusive remark is offered on Christopher's What is to be Done. So certain underlying ideas and certain movements related to this can be for example, the autonomous Marxism that we see operative in Italy, which tries to engage not only non-knowledge or knowledge-based or intellectual labor, whatever that might be, but also in general worker questions and also and you know it is an idea that remains in certain parts of Italy, still worth talking about. In recent years, we've seen an increasing number of publications that offer the term and of rentierism. And one of the key arguments traversing these accounts is that since the late 1970s, there's been a major shift towards a system of economic production and reproduction in which income generation has increasingly come to be a matter of possessing and controlling valuable assets that are scarce or artificially made scarce. And we've seen reflections on that scarcity question before. And these are there are going to be real scarcities at a certain level, but much of it, the idea of trying to drive economies by manufacturing scarcity is the underlying problem of mainstream economics. This corresponds to a mode of economic organization in which money making rests increasingly on having rather than doing, or extracting value rather than creating it. And more recently, Christopher has offered a critique of rentierism as a contribution to the literature. And It's it's an approach that is ideological. It has an ideological element, and certainly Piketty is part of that. Or as we've seen with other folks like Mazzucato, um, Sayer, and Standing, the idea of moral economy. And we've talked about that as well, about a sort of social ontology. And this empirically grounded and elegantly articulated critique, Marx is mainly neglected, but Marx is always there. It's just problematic because then you have to sort of argue through some of the basic problems, and sometimes people are very fixed on certain commitments to certain forms of labor or a certain idea about labor versus labor power, etc. Christopher argues Marx's rent was essentially everyone else's rent, that is Ricardo's rent, Smith's rent, Adam Smith's rent. In Marx, rent was a pre-capitalist category, that is a marginal residue or ephemeral phenomenon within capitalism. This view leads Christophers to offer an early conclusion that the reality of the early 21st century, that is rentierism, clearly belies Marx. Somehow, this argument is disputable. The aim of this little article is not to discuss to what extent the transformation of industrialism into rentierism was latently present in Marx's writing, or to summarize how Marxist scholars foresaw early and theorized the return of rentierism precisely through Marx. Instead, this particular article aims to bring Marx and autonomist Marxist thought, remember I mentioned Italian versions of this, back into discussion to read rentierism politically. That is a strategic reading of rentierism from the perspective of class relations. Indeed, Christopher's analysis of rentier capitalism is largely confined to the realm of economics and its reified categories. Herein, the concept of capitalism seems to designate not the social relations between classes, but rather a set of economic actors, mostly corporations, and economic parameters, such as asset prices, investment volumes, productivity, growth rates, all circulating as mindless entities through the ups and downs of capital circuits. In brief, Christophers does not engage with the question of how rentierism relates to the nature of the class relations, and that's a problem. And this particular article aims to address the class relations question. And it's not so much about trying to identify all these classes, which is what is at work in a lot of this research, but rather to see it as a means by which you can see value. Where is value located? Is it always going to be located in one place or the other, Department 1 or Department 2, or is it shared among them? Does it occur within the kind of relations, the motion between departments, between different circuits of capital? And making those kinds of arguments is important because the presumption of a certain type of circuit-like and particularly a body of sort of nested circuits is actually important. In the first part of this article, the author summarizes Christopher's account of rentier capitalism to make first-time readers acquainted with his ideas, as well as to contextualize the contribution of this particular article. And that is, it is about an enclosure and expropriation of the commons. And the commons could be in the model of the tragedy of the commons, which is problematic for all kinds of reasons, including racist reasons. And it has a certain presence and a highly problematic presence, but commons do exist. They have existed. They can't help but exist in some ways, but we don't take them as a kind of given so much as we spend a fair amount of time working through some of the conflicts. So in the second part of this little story, it's about, and I don't know if we'll get through it today, we'll probably continue it on at some moment, perhaps Monday, discuss the truism through Marx and autonomous Marxist thought. In particular, this article analyzes rentierism as a political project, that is, capital's counter movement, enforces separation on spaces where communities organize on the terrain of commons, experiment with the processes of commoning. And commoning means, you interact, share resources, that's sort of what the ontology is about, and develop alternative ways of social reproduction that are increasingly outside the circuits of capital. So this sense of outside and inside is actually fairly important, and can be easily defined in a kind of a very base sort of way. But you need to sort of think of this in a slightly larger way now that there is more internet connections among all these things. So defining rent as income derived from the ownership, possession, or control of scarce assets and under condition of limited or no competition, and rentiers as those whose income primarily comes from the control of those assets. Christophers identifies rentier capitalism as Western countries' contemporary economic system that is substantially scaffolded by and organized around the assets that generate those rents and sustain those rentiers. So there are some qualifiers, of course. Christopher recognizes only a few rent-bearing assets, if any, generate income automatically. That is, rent income requires control of an asset under conditions of limited or no competition, as well as some work for the delivery of the product or service underwritten it. So there's some kind of control, either direct or indirect, given the broad definition of rent. Secondly, Christopher acknowledges that most economic production involves rentier elements. And this is, a fully realized economy at work. What is particular about rentier capitalism in connection to the first point is that of scale. And I've talked about this before, that, scaling or a certain dimensionality is actually really important for all of these elements. It entails rent-bearing assets being not just leveraged in production, but substantively so. Indeed, he shows that the leading corporations in the United Kingdom are largely rentiers. That's, Britain is largely a rentier economy, and the biggest sectors of the economy are largely characterized by rentier dynamics. He remarkably puts that rent is their shared raison d'etre, and rentierism is embedded in their individual and collective DNA. And the third point, Christopher underlines that rentierism is not a novel phenomenon. This goes back, right? We're now witnessing the return and ascendancy of it. He agrees with Origi and Piketty in that the rentierization of the economy has been a cyclical phenomenon over the longue durée, punctuating international capitalist development on a recurring basis. Longue durée is French annals school history. It describes not unlike a Kondratiev cycle. It's not like business cycles. It's really long cycles of the history unfolds. It has many more dimensions to it. There's a whole sections of history that have been neglected, and the point of view of annals school theory, Braudel, etc., is to look at these longer swings, some which have problematic elements of agency. In other words, there's some people history just doesn't write about, and there's some basic processes. The facts of everyday life can be, often neglected, and yet it often whole histories or political economies are based on some strange kind of interconnections that are less about class, direct class conflict, but a whole evolution of things. As I said, Braudel probably is the best historical example, and it's kind of the idea that the peasantry has a history and we should pay attention to it. The return of rentierism, according to Christophers, has taken shape over the course of the past 4 decades under neoliberal economic policies. How? He offers 4 key respects in which neoliberalism has had beneficial consequences for rentierism. The first one is a growing pool of valuable assets have been made available for capital owners through privatization, financial deregulation, and so forth. And you can just see that. And, this is the Reagan era writ large, carried on even further by Bill Clinton et al. Policies such as the neutralization of competition have been activated, enabling asset owners to further exploit their assets commercially. Number 3, rentier-friendly monetary and fiscal policies such as tax subsidies have been created. The simple tax subsidy is, of course, to just cut them. And trillions of dollars have, driven our economy in a very bad direction, and we're just only managing to get by. And if you vote the wrong way in November, it'll get worse, with all due respect. Number 4, asset prices have artificially been accelerated to promote rentierism and make renters more wealthy. For Christopher's, the return of rentierism has had several adverse consequences for the British economy. The starting point is what he calls the essence of rentierism, namely monopoly power in the control and exploitation of rent-bearing assets, inimical to economic dynamism, innovation, and the development of production. By analyzing the UK data, Christopher shows how the lack of motivation to innovate and advance the production process has gone hand in hand with a plunge of capital investment and labor productivity since the 1970s. The inevitable result has been declining growth in economic output, that is, a slowdown in the overall economy. In other words, you could have, there's certain measures of growth that are problematic. The latter has been then culminated in a major resorting of incomes in a way that the pain has been shouldered by workers, while capital has begun to enjoy a greater share of national income. In parallel, finally, wealth inequality has increased dynamically, a typical result of rentierism as discussed by Piketty and, or Piketty, I'm sorry. Rentierism in the common. In this part, this is a political reading of rentierism based on the understanding of concept of capital as a social relationship in which opposing forces confront each other. It is this antagonistic relationship that capital acts as a force that is committed to a continuous expansion, that is accumulate. That, that is Moses and the prophet, as Marx says. This commitment concerns not only growth in monetary terms, but also the continuous accumulation of capital relation. That is, the capitalist process of production produces not only commodities, the front end of volume 1 of capital, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capital relation itself. On the one hand, the capitalist, on the other hand, the wage laborer. What capital desires, in other words, is to create life worlds in its own image, or to colonize existing ones since the beginning of its history until it's colonized all of life. That's some of what goes on in certain kind of digital worlds that have been created. But, that's a more extreme version. Nevertheless, capital exists with other forces that act as a limit on its sole drive to valorize itself. Marx identifies the major opposing social force as living labor as subjective being. That is, this latter force expresses an absolute interest. For example, the emancipation from capital that can't be mediated. This interest manifests itself in political actions such as strikes, refusal of work, sabotage, slowdown, absenteeism, and so on. But it also manifests itself in more radical forms, which include not only resistance, but also reversal, such as the invention of alternative socioeconomic systems that provide various degrees of protection from the relations of capitalism. And this is, some people always have this kind of hope that, create better, more collaborative or collective forms. Confronted with this, capital creates and implements counter strategies because it cannot abide limits. Capital is the endless and limitless drive to go beyond its limiting barrier. Every limit appears as a barrier to overcome. In defining rentierism as a socioeconomic system in which incomes are substantially generated by rents, Christopher's also provides an overview of the core asset types, which I've mentioned above, that are at the center of the system. He identifies these assets as land, natural resources such as water, that also yields natural monopoly rents, intellectual property, electromagnetic spectrum, user-generated data on digital platforms, and financial assets that often manifest themselves as the tradable form of other rent-bearing assets, for example, commodity markets. The little book that I'm trying to figure out, the popular press, the trade press version will be some manifestation of this as a kind of virtual capital. What is notable here, in my opinion, is that all these assets that generate rents and sustain rentierism can fairly be understood as the commons. If rentierism designates a system of economic production and reproduction that dominantly characterizes today's capitalism in the global north, this system is based essentially on the enclosure and expropriation of the commons. Now, note that this is not only a kind of direct enclosure, but is also indirect, has indirect elements in it as well. Or, you could refer to them as analog versus digital or a variety of other ways. In the literature, the commons refer typically to a resource pool that contains all the creations of nature that we inherit jointly and freely and hold in trust for future generations. Certainly sounds like air, water, land, rivers, forest, fruits of the soil, fisheries, electromagnetic spectrum, and so forth, the commonwealth of the material world. Yet there's extensive Marxist literature that conceptualizes the commons beyond the fruits of nature. Here, the commons are also understood as human-made resources, and that includes a wider version of that. And of course, you can see the interrelation of that in terms of various creative activities, cultural activities, or the fact that people use the commons to interact socially, whose creation is based on the general intellect and affect of humankind, and in many cases are produced through channels of social cooperation beyond the capital relation. Well, yes and no. I mean, social capital is generated that way, and it's kind of important, and even more important in the age of social media, as we've seen with the fundraising for Kamala Harris. Indeed, according to Marx, products such as knowledge, language, information, affects, ideas, and so forth, are the creations of universal and communal labor brought about partly by the cooperation of people now living, but partly also by building on earlier work. In this broader view, the commons are understood both as a noun and as a verb. So there's this kind of commoning. They refer to nature's gift and human-made communal resources, but also to the processes of production whereby these resources are allocated, used, and produced or reproduced in a way that increasingly escapes the capital relationship, i.e. commoning. In his seminal article, Tragedy of the Commons, Hardin, 1968, conceptualizes the commons as resources for which there is free and unmanaged access. He argues that this unregulated access would inevitably culminate in resource depletion and environmental degradation, because humans are naturally competitive economic creatures, homo economicus, that would try to maximize their revenue and thereby not take care of these common resources, as there is no incentive to do so, and eventually plunder them. Now, this is a kind of libertarian model that verges, as Hardin himself does, into a kind of sort of Malthusian sort of error about, well, you just can't help people, and it's just going to, there's this moment that we're just not going to be able to control ourselves relative to growth, and rather than collectively regulating it, there should be some other means by which this tragedy is overcome. That is by reinforcing certain private controls, which is doomed to failure, as I think that we've seen in modern development. The policy implications of this approach are clear. The most rational way to sustain the commons is either through private or state-led governance. Viewed as the intellectual rehabilitation of the commons, the works of Ostrom elegantly show that Hardin's tragedy is far from inevitable. Ostrom finds that the commons involve communities, and there's a kind of a network, a kind of polystate that emerges from Ostrom's work. There's a fair amount of interesting research done on this. The idea that, and it's really no different than thinking in a kind of more bioregional way about how you do governance, et cetera. Thinking in terms of not necessarily in a purely solid state way, but that you think more regionally. Anyway, Ostrom finds that the commons involves communities that negotiate the modalities of access to these resources. And that may sound, like basic regulation, but it's one enabled by a sort of broader interconnected network. And I would argue that you create, as in a new sense or different sense of governance in that same way. And there's actually a literature for it, one that is based, more on sustainability, et cetera, degrowth at all. These communities engage in a form of self-management that effectively arranges the collective allocation of common resources and user responsibilities. This organization enables the sustainability of the commons and the related communities for centuries. In a nutshell, Eleanor Ostrom, the only, as well, up till a couple of years ago, the only woman to have gotten a Nobel Prize. There have been at least one or two since then. Ostrom's works are essential to recognize that many communities can organize in the common, to manage the allocation of common resources and responsibilities between users. And Foucault refers to this in part of the literature as a kind of governmentality. However, some scholars argue that despite its strengths, Ostrom's analysis does not go far enough. In Ostrom's cases, what comes after the allocation of common resources is private ownership. That is, one can sell the allocated resource to make money. And some authors show that for many communities, the process of commoning includes not only organizing in the common, that is the democratic and sustainable allocation of resources, but also organizing for and of the common, that is the collective and democratic use and reproduction of the commons, respectively. In these communities, in other words, the process of commoning does not stop once the resources and responsibilities are communally allocated. It also defines the modes of use and reproduction of those resources through democratic and horizontal forms of governance. Now, this is actually very important. The simple libertarian version of following the tragedy of the commons would simply be, just bring in the cops or whatever. It's very Republican in that particular sense. And it depends on who owns it and who determines that. And of course, there's always problems with that involve all kinds of things like racism, et cetera. In this framework, I think we can better understand the political meaning of rentierism, characterized by the enclosure and expropriation of the commons. Marx writes that what creates the capital relation can be nothing other than the process which divorces the worker from the ownership of the conditions of his own labor. Indeed, for Marx, the divorce of labor from her means of subsistence forms the concept of capital. Marx is extremely precise on this. The capital relation presupposes a complete separation between the workers and the ownership for the conditions for the realization of their labor. This is that, reasons for seizing the means of production. This relation, according to Marx, evolves in such a way that that is capital, maintains and reproduces this separation on a constantly increasing scale until the historical reversal takes place. Now, this is an important argument because people will say, well, eventually it's going to turn on itself for whatever magical reason that historical materialism is going to guarantee it, and that has cursed various sub-movements badly. The historical reversal Marx mentions here suggests an association between direct producers and the means of production, or more generally, workers' access to, use, and reproduce of social wealth in a mode of organization that is not strictly mediated by the natural laws of capitalism. The fact that capitalism, that there are claims that there are natural laws of capitalism is even problematic. The commons resisting enclosures and the practices of commoning that emerge around these commons are threats to the ordinary run of things. They present themselves as a limit on the very premise of capitalist social relations, that is, separation. The communities that produce and reproduce through the practices of commoning are not utopias. They are real antagonistic movements, showing that there can be a sustainable life beyond capital and state around the commons. In this regard, rentierism does indeed concern the enclosure of the commons through the mechanisms of accumulation by dispossession, that is, the transfer of common assets to the upper classes as a response to the inner contradictions of capital accumulation, especially when surpluses of capital lie idle with no profitable industrial production outlets in sight. Now, this can be read in a variety of ways, but one simple way is that during the Trump administration, federal lands were being given up, not to people who had any land claim because of, indigenous claims or anything, but simply so that, capitalists could exploit them better. And that's been the general modus for a certain brand of drill baby drill capitalism that Trump invokes in every speech. It's that, oh, the first day we're going to drill baby drill, whatever. The reality, of course, is that drill baby drill is always going on, and it's really not a choice of one or the other. And it's simply a call to profit ultimately, and it's sort of meaningless relative to the actual mineral extraction rules that have been put in place for decades. However, given that every economic category is simultaneously political, rentierism should also be read as capital's political counter-movement, enforcing separation on spaces where communities organize around the commons and experiment with the practices of commoning towards inventing alternative social systems that are not determined by the priorities and drives of capital. Now, this would be interesting if you actually made choices about bioregional energy use and a variety of other kinds of things. So a concluding remark on reclaiming the commons, so that rentierism or rentier capitalism rests essentially on the enclosure and expropriation of the commons, which have an ambivalent relationship with capital. The commons are used as the basis for capitalist growth. However, the same commons also constitute the basis for alternative autopoietic social systems that might overcome the hegemony of capital. Now, that's an interesting problem, and you can actually even say that, for example, Mondragon syndicalism or socialism of a sort is that actual, kind of autopoietic social system. Enclosures, in other words, define a strategic terrain among social forces. By enclosing the commons, capital attempts to fix or temporarily overcome its intercontradictions. That is in rentierism. This is an important concept because there's a constant manufacture of these kinds of things. It's just, it's how finance capital operates in many ways, and particularly in the case of land policy. But in doing so, it simultaneously destroys the cell form of the social force that is responsible to establish and reproduce life, and by this to abolish capital. In the final chapter of Rentier Capitalism, Christophers discusses 4 key areas in which some actions should be taken to move beyond rentierism. And I think we can actually move beyond rentierism. It's to sort of constantly critique it rather than have it creep up on you almost in every kind of system that we have. So competition policy is a key area, the tax system, certainly, state-led formation of a new economy, and ownership. And he aptly puts the accent on the latter, for ownership underpins all the others. Indeed, what, after all, is rentier capitalism if not a mode of economic production and reproduction in which the bulk of society's valuable economic assets are owned by capital? And this has to do with some very simple ideas, and I've mentioned the examples before about, water rights for Southern California that extend far beyond California, upstream versus downstream in that kind of resource, and then, all of the variations on problems of air quality, for example, et cetera. Christophers suggests that these assets should be retaken from rentiers, but when retaken, who will own them? He offers a mixed plural ecology of ownership, and whatever that means, in which, for example, some natural resources are given to the state. Intellectual properties stay in private hands and others are transferred to some communities. Yet he does not explain why intellectual properties stay in private hands, and that's an important issue. I think it's left open, because the Social Democrats might have an issue. But anyway, his closing is in Kurelik's closing is slightly more provocative. As various social movements across the world have been expressing for decades, neither markets nor states have been able to provide social justice, sustainability, and happy lives for all. While states cannot be abstracted from capital, that is, this is the so-called state finance nexus, capital in turn reproduces social economic injustices, asymmetrical power relations, environmental catastrophes, and depressed lives. The commons belong to their real owners, namely the commoners who can, under particular conditions, define for themselves alternative social systems that are not mediated by capital of the state. What these conditions, as well as the limits and boundaries of commoning, might be and how they can be addressed collectively might inform future research. So that's the little article. I'm sorry it went over a little bit, but the point is to reappropriate, as it were, that which is the commons, and to recognize that it's not simply about land, but it is more about the sort of broad system of things that include property rights and a variety of other things that are part of this commoning. So you can apply this concept to, for example, bandwidth allocation in a region, access to various resources, rights of way, a variety of other things that are all much more seemingly invisible or ephemeral, but actually determine ever significant elements of how capital is organized and problematized at a city, regional, state, nation sort of levels. And all of these are problematic. You can see them in the current economy. You can see that in your own local or regional economy, and you can see the misuse of it probably every damn day in a variety of ways that don't seem quite obvious to us. And I think that's really important. So I'm going to stop there. You can ask your questions. Yes, Larry, communism is a political counter movement to capital. But communism defines some mode of production. And if you can't, it's a transformation of production, a total transformation of production, which is sort of the Soviet state in that particular context. Not that the ideal is the Soviet state, but that a total command economy would certainly be a political counter movement. But often I think that's the problem of many political groups, is that they assert that they're communists. And that's sort of a nice and noble kind of goal. But the reality is that we're still sort of in capitalism, a much more mixed economy, but we're nowhere near a communist economy. And in fact, maybe we don't really want to get there anyway, for the reasons of really existing socialism that sort of didn't work real well for a variety of reasons.
Thanks. The other question I had was about, where I work. We're not really a bank. We have a bank that we partner with, but most of our revenue is generated by fees from account holders.
Yes.
And is that an example of?
Oh yes, that's the home of rent. That's Rentier at its best.
Okay.
I mean, it exists everywhere, right? We have to, there's a certain moment at which we have to update our software, and sometimes they want us to pay for it, or pay for it in a variety of sort of insidious ways. But
it's everywhere. Yeah.
Fees are rents. Fees are rents. And they may seem rather trivial, but when you add them all up, right, they're pretty significant.
Yeah, death by 1,000 cuts, right?
Oh, it is. But we get used to it. We just sort of give it up easily. Not that we're supposed to all be, penny pinchers, but we don't even have pennies to pinch, I guess. That's the It's like being in a book club, where you sort of, you give them your credit card and they send you something every month, and then you forget about it and they keep sending you crap. And
yeah, I've got what is it? Curiosity Stream subscription.
Yes, yes, there we go. Are no left turns on red from a one-way to a one-way a part of closing the comments? It would reduce the number of accidents in the region called New England a lot. In driving on a two-way street with occasional left turn lanes, aka third lanes, I drive in terror because New Englanders will not signal that they're going to try and make a left turn right in front of you. And so you're barreling down there at a normal speed, and then at random they decide they're going to turn, and then some bad things can happen.
Always, one of my mantras is, three rights make a left. It's like, sometimes it's easier to make three rights.
In some ways, this is just, you could say it's a kind of selfishness, I suppose. And in fact, in queuing theory, I think there actually is a model for this. But anyway, it's just, I'm not going to become head of the Department of Transportation at any time soon. But
too many subversive ideas.
It seems to be there are problems with that. And to talk more generally, I've been looking at new polling, and it appears that Pete Buttigieg is gaining traction as the VP for Harris, which I find interesting only because there's been a recent re-earthing of J.D. Vance's earlier social media that suggests that he identified as being gay. So that's even more interesting, only because, of course, he was supported by Peter Thiel, and so there's this whole gay Republican thing going on, which makes a Buttigieg vice presidency more amusing, just in the short run, in terms of what's that debate going to look like.
Yeah, interesting.
It's just interesting that choosing J.D. Vance has that sort of a conservative gay person thing going on underneath that is just weird.
J.D. Vance is gay?
He identified as gay a while back, and there's a little.
I thought he was married.
Oh yes, he is.
To a woman.
That has never stopped people from being gay.
I suppose that's true. Yes.
And that's the kind of Republican versions of being gay are just like that, right? Lindsey Graham, for example.
Is that in his book?
Yes, it's in an earlier book, I think, an earlier writing or something. There's literature out there. I don't make this stuff up. It does explain it. It does explain his eyeliner, but I don't know. Anyway.
He wears eyeliner?
Well, if you look at anyway.
He's got big eyelashes.
Yeah, whatever that means.
I saw last night, I saw that Majority Report bit about Peter Thiel, and he was doing a very poor job of answering, some questions from the audience fairly recently, I guess. And, it was like, he like I am now struggled with speaking. It was sort of like, deflating the image of him as this, tech overlord kind of guy.
Yeah, tech bros.
Elon looked, eloquent compared to him.
Elon. Well, I think I've exceeded my time, and at top of the hour is after hours. Tonight there will be Twilight Zone, I think. Is John around to talk about this? Or is he in the midst of doing other stuff?
I am here.
Oh, here you are. Tell us
Yeah.
about Twilight Zone, John.
Twilight Zone tonight is an episode starring Edward Andrews, who we have seen before in the Twilight Zone. This is his second and final appearance. It is an episode called You Drive.
You drive?
Yeah.
Is it like the U-Haul?
Yeah, it's about moving. It's about renting a U-Haul and
How appropriate.
yeah, exactly. And it involves a haunting.
Oh, I don't think that's on my Ryder truck rental.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to pay extra not to get the haunting.
All righty. I think later tonight we'll have Prisoner. I think we're up to episode 10. So we're moving along, and that will exist later on. I'm not sure if there's anything else that's been scheduled. Weekly Marks will be tomorrow at 3. The Writers Workshop. I'm not sure whether we have Belly Box tomorrow. I hope we do. And Columbo on the weekend. And that's all I have to say at the present moment. I'm at the end of our little session here. We will come back to this idea about rentierism because it has implications for other stuff. That is, the transformation problem, capital reswitching. All of these things are interrelated with this, and the idea that we're dealing with larger rent-like forms that are part of the real problem of modern capitalism. And perhaps later on, I'll mention my favorite new film, which is The Killer Room, which I find quite amusing, but that's just because I happen to find it amusing. That's all. I'm sure other people will find it less amusing. It has Uma Thurman in it, for those who are Uma Thurman fans.
On Sunday, or last Sunday, did we not watch the last of the Columbo episodes?
Oh, that's right. We've watched the last Columbo. John, can you answer the question about whether we're going to start with Mission to Farpoint or whatever the hell it is for Next Generation?
So I wanted to know, I don't think I'm going to have time to do my slide deck because I've got a lot of stuff to do this weekend, but we didn't quite finish the original series movies. I was wondering if we should, we saw the first 2.
Oh, well, the original series movies are quite interesting.
Yes. So I thought maybe we should watch those before we start the Next Generation.
So we'll do 3 and 4, which I always find 4 probably, well, to me, 4 is the best of the bunch, but that's just
I love 4. Yeah. 3, yeah, I was thinking of doing 3. We could do 3 and 4. They kind of go together, but yeah, we'll do at least one of them on Sunday at 5.
excellent. We'll bring our whatever
Yeah, set your phasers to stun, please.
our Saurian ale and blood wine. Bring your blood